Hello and welcome to the podcast. This is Ron's Amazing Stories, where we play tales to take you away from today. On the program today, we have a full slate of amazing stories.
Jolly good fun. Jolly good.
I like to think so. We have 3 more ghost tales from you guys, a big Texas ghost, a missing kitty, and a light-switching shadow.
What a crazy world.
It appears so. Our featured story is a classic sci-fi adventure with time travel, intelligent rodents, and a surprise ending.
Impossible.
And we end the show with another not-so-important time in history.
It's amazing.
Let it all start with this special 2.5-minute mystery.
And now, a new 2.5-minute mystery.
This 2.5-minute mystery is being brought to you by Scott Rickoff, the very first person to submit a detective riddle for us to solve. Scott lives in Eden Prairie, Minnesota. Here is our story. Detective Frank Peters arrives on the scene of what appears to be a suicide. The man was found by his friend and business partner, Malcolm Frobish. The victim was shot in the head while inside his car with no powder burns on the body. All of the car's windows were rolled up and the doors were locked. But the weapon was found outside the vehicle. After inspecting the car, Peters found that there were no additional bullet holes, and in fact, the car was in pristine shape. Malcolm insists that it was suicide. However, Detective Peter holds him on suspicion of murder anyway. He knows that there was no suicide. But do you know why?
In just a minute, we'll have our solution. But first, a message from our sponsor.
Do you enjoy these 2.5-minute mysteries? Please let me know. Also, if you have one to share, I'd love to hear it. Go to ronsamazingstories.com and click on the Contact tab. And now, here is our solution. Did you figure it out? The guy was found dead sitting in his convertible, so no other bullet holes. But the big problem? If it had been a suicide, there would have been powder burns. I suspect that Malcolm is the murderer, but who can say for sure? This 2.5-minute mystery was brought to you by Scott Rickoff of Eden Prairie, Minnesota. Scott didn't say how he came by the story or if he wrote it himself. He did say that he likes these 2.5-minute mysteries. Thank you, Scott.
Is that you say?
Well, I hope we're all getting along, doing whatever, and keeping busy and healthy. I did receive a bunch of stories this week, and I want to thank everyone that has sent one in. I'm working my way through them as fast as I can, and will use as many of them as possible. One thing I'm toying with is having an all-listener story show. We've done that before, and from the feedback, you thought it was pretty good. I'll keep you updated on this one. The storytelling episode with Alton Chung is going to be delayed. It was set to release on April 16th, but Alton has run into some trouble. He's currently stuck in Hawaii due to travel restrictions and family issues. I will keep you updated, and please keep Alton in your thoughts. Those of you that have sent in ghost stories for that show, I do apologize for the delay. I don't think it'll be a long one. We may record the show while Alton is in Hawaii. I received this email from Aura Parker, who coincidentally lives in Honolulu. Hey Ron, these are strange times, and I wanted to thank you for your podcast and ask a question. You play so many different types of stories, and you seem to know a lot about what you're presenting. How and why is that? I get it if you don't want to answer, but please do. Aura. Well, another question I've never had before. First, let me say that I'm an old guy. Being around a while exposes you to a lot of stuff. Secondly, the first time I went to college, I was an English major. I took a lot of literature classes, and in fact, loved every one of them. Later, I would audit writing and lit classes just for fun. Yeah, I am a nerd. Finally, I'm an editor now, after years of working as an engineer. And in both fields, it required me to do a lot of research. Fact-checking and all that goes with it. It's probably one of my favorite things to do. Every story that you hear on the show, including those submitted by you guys, I do as much research as I can. For example, I look at the town the person's from, I look at the places they mention, and verify as many facts as I can. All in the name of the podcast. But hey, let's be honest. I'd probably do the research anyway. Why? Because I truly am a nerd. Now, with that said, here is this week's Audible pick. Today's podcast is brought to you by Audible. Get a free audiobook and a 30-day free trial at audibletrial.com/Ron's Amazing Stories. They have over 180,000 titles to choose from for your iPhone, Android, computer, Kindle. Whatever you have, you can listen to Audible on it. So what am I listening to right now? I am a true fan of science fiction, and my monthly choices at Audible trend that way. One of the best books that I have purchased from Audible comes from the pen of Arthur C. Clarke. It is the tale of Rendezvous with Rama, and we've talked about this one before. At first, only a few things are known about the celestial object that astronomers have dubbed Rama. It is huge, weighing more than 10 trillion tons, and it's hurtling through the solar system at an inconceivable speed. Here is a brief sample from near the beginning of the book. This clip is a table-setting moment for the rest of the book, and I ask you to think about what you would do if this happened today.
The extraordinary meeting of the Space Advisory Council was brief and stormy. Even by the 22nd century, no way had yet been discovered of keeping elderly and conservative scientists from occupying crucial administrative positions. Indeed, it was doubted if the problem ever would be solved. To make matters worse, the current chairman of SAC was Professor Emeritus Olaf Davidson, the distinguished astrophysicist. Professor Davidson was not much interested in objects smaller than galaxies, and never bothered to conceal his prejudices. And though he had to admit that 90% of his science was now based upon observations from space-borne instruments, he was not at all happy about it. No fewer than 3 times during his distinguished career, satellites specially launched to prove one of his pet theories had done precisely the opposite. The question before the council was straightforward enough. There was no doubt that Rama was an unusual object, but was it an important one? In a few months it would be gone forever, so there was little time in which to act. Opportunities missed now would never recur. At a rather horrifying cost, a space probe, soon to be launched from Mars to go beyond Neptune, could be modified and sent on a high-speed trajectory to meet Rama. There was no hope of a rendezvous. It would be the fastest flyby on record, for the two bodies would pass each other at 200,000 kilometers an hour. Rama would be observed intensively for only a few minutes, and in real close-up for less than a second. But with the right instrumentation, that would be long enough to settle many questions. Although Davidson took a jaundiced view of the Neptune probe, it had already been approved, and he saw no point in sending more good money after bad. He spoke eloquently on the follies of asteroid chasing, and on the urgent need for a new, high-resolution interferometer on the Moon to prove the newly revived Big Bang theory of creation once and for all. That was a grave tactical error, because the three most ardent supporters of the modified steady-state theory were also members of the Council. They secretly agreed with Davidson that asteroid chasing was a waste of money. Nevertheless, he lost by 1 vote. 3 months later, the space probe, rechristened Sita, was launched from Phobos, the inner moon of Mars. The flight time was 7 weeks, and the instrument was switched to full power only 5 minutes before interception. Simultaneously, a cluster of camera pods was released to sail past Rama so that it could be photographed from all sides. The first images, from 10,000 kilometers away, brought to a halt the activities of all mankind. On 1 billion television screens, there appeared a tiny, featureless cylinder, growing rapidly second by second. By the time it had doubled its size, no one could pretend any longer that Rama was a natural object. Its body was a cylinder so geometrically perfect that it might have been turned on a lathe, one with centers 50 kilometers apart. The two ends were quite flat, apart from some small structures at the center of one face, and were 20 kilometers across. From a distance, when there was no sense of scale, Rama looked almost comically like an ordinary domestic boiler. Rama grew until it filled the screen. Its surface was a dull, drab gray, as colorless as the moon, and completely devoid of markings except at one point. Halfway along the cylinder there was a kilometer-wide stain, or smear, as if something had once hit and splattered ages ago. There was no sign that the impact had done the slightest damage to Rama's spinning walls, but this mark had produced the slight fluctuation in brightness that had led to Stenton's discovery. The images from the other cameras added nothing new. However, the trajectories their pods traced through Rama's minute gravitational field gave one other vital piece of information: the mass of the cylinder. It was far too light to be a solid body. To nobody's great surprise, it was clear that Rama must be hollow. The long-hoped-for, long-feared encounter had come at last. Mankind was about to receive the first visitor from the stars.
Rendezvous with Rama was first published in 1972. It did something that only 3 books in history have ever done. It won the trifecta of sci-fi awards. It has the Hugo, the Nebula, and the John C. Campbell Awards for Best Science Fiction Story. That's incredible. But who was Clarke? Well, Sir Arthur Charles Clarke was a British science fiction writer, futurist. He was an inventor, undersea explorer, and believe it or not, television series host. He wrote the book and co-wrote the screenplay for the 1968 film 2001: A Space Odyssey, one of the most influential films of all time. Bottom line, this guy was pretty good. Now, you can have his book, Rendezvous with Rama, today. And here's what Audible has set up for us. Audible is offering a free audiobook and 30 days to give you the opportunity to check out their service. To download your free audiobook, go to audibletrial.com/Ron's Amazing Stories. Again, that's audibletrial.com/Ron's Amazing Stories, and you can get your free book today. Thank you, Audible. And now it's time for your stories.
These are your stories, sent by you, for you.
I've asked for ghost stories, and the bulk of the stories that have been sent in of late are ghostly in nature. My favorite type is the head scratcher, and here is one sent in by Grady Carr from San Felipe, Texas. He calls this, "Even the Ghosts Are Big in Texas." Hey Ron, thank you for reading my story. I was thrilled when I got your note that you wanted to hear it. I don't believe in the paranormal, but there's no doubt that something strange happened to me on June 13th, 2002. I'll never forget it, and I can't explain it. Oh, and please use that bad Texas accent of yours. It makes me laugh. I was out walking the dogs. Their names are Dragon and Thunder. Now, I'll bet you're thinking these pups are probably bulldogs or Rottweilers. You'd be wrong. Think Pepe and Chi-Chi. Yep, my puppies are Chihuahuas. Not exactly what you would call fierce. We were at a park here in town called the Malcolm E. Beckendorf Family Park. It's a quiet place, usually. We were out walking around the outside when I saw a light floating a few yards away. I can't say I ever saw or heard anything like it before. It just floated there. As I got closer, I could faintly see the shape of a man, a very big man who was at least 7 feet tall. I couldn't make out any details, but he appeared to be wearing a wide-brim hat. Cowboy hat, if you will. I looked around the park to see if anyone else was around, but I was alone. So it was just me, my pups, and Big Doll and Bride. As I got closer, the dogs began to bark in a way that only a Chihuahua can do. I swear that bright thing turned to look at the boys, and they went from the brave to the whimper in seconds. I also swear by all that is holy, the light went from white to orange and back to white again in a heartbeat. I stopped walking, and the boys ducked in behind me. It was a standoff for a few seconds, neither moving forward or back. Then that bright light began to dim and eventually was gone. I have no idea what I saw that night. I had no camera or anything to prove what I say is true, but it happened just the way I described it. I've been back to that park many times, and I've never seen it since. I've asked friends and neighbors if they had any experience in the park. Most said no, but my good friend, we'll call him Bart, said every time he's walking his dog in the park, he feels like he's being watched. He can't explain it any better than that. One last thing. Just a few hours before my walk, we'd had a flash lightning storm in the area. I've always wondered if the two were somehow connected. Grady Carr, San Felipe, Texas. Well, Grady, that is an amazing story. I did a little research and I found a picture of your park so I can see exactly what you were talking about. It seems like a perfect place to walk your dog. I tried to research the name of the park for maybe a clue. I couldn't find out why or how the park was named, so my guess is that it was a donation by Malcolm. Have you ever done any research on the grounds where the park stands? That could be interesting and may answer some of your questions or create a whole bunch of new ones. Thank you for your story, Grady, and thank you for asking that I use my bad Texas accent. Good night, y'all. Our next story comes from Arky645. Sorry, that's all I have on this person. If you are Arky and would like story credit, just send me your name and where you're from. Here is her story. Hey Ron, I'm writing you in response to the cat story you recently had on your show. I was taken aback by it. I'm a cat lover myself and thought that was the best story you've ever had on the show. Thank you, and please tell Melissa as well. I have my own story to share, but it's not as big or as grand. My cat was missing for about a week. It was about 1:30 a.m. and I decided to pull my curtains down. I saw what looked like her green glowing eyes in the window, and I definitely heard a meow. As anyone would do, I opened the window and called for her. She never came. The next day I was out in the backyard looking for her, and it was about 16 degrees outside. I looked into our pond, and there she was, just her ears sticking out of the ice. I was heartbroken and didn't know what had happened or what to do. When my husband came home, he chipped her out of the ice, and we buried her in the backyard. The next night I heard the meow again and ran to the window. I saw nothing, but somehow the sound was content and happy. I know that makes no sense. Arky645. Well, the story that Arky is referring to was called My Beloved Black Cat, and it can be heard on episode number 428. It was sent in by Melissa Starkey. To Arky I say, thank you for your story, and I do think it was just as big and just as grand. You obviously cared a lot for your kitty. Our last story for this time comes from Stephanie Ferguson, who writes to us from somewhere in Colorado. Hey Ron, you've asked for ghost stories and I have one. So a couple years ago we moved into my grandma's old house. This place is huge, so my whole family moved in and everything was good. I love ghost shows, but never really believed any of it. It was just entertaining to imagine ghosts being real. So every time I heard a strange noise or had a feeling like someone was watching me, I just joked and pretended to be a ghost hunter. Until one night. I went downstairs about 2 a.m. to get water and food. As I was pouring the water, I heard a noise from behind the door, but thought nothing of it, until I heard the switch get flicked and the light turned off. I just thought someone was messing with me or something like that, but when I turned around, I saw a shadow figure in the other room, where the switch is, quickly dash out of the doorway. Obviously, I thought it was my brother, but when I checked, nothing. That's when I panicked a little and my heart started racing. I ran back upstairs, but found everyone was asleep. The next day, my dog was looking at that very same light switch and was barking. I told everyone in the house about my experience. My brother, mom, and uncle all had the same thing happen to them in different rooms throughout the house. Now, everyone just looks at that corner, but me, I avoid it as much as possible. Stephanie Ferguson, Colorado. Wow, that is a crazy story, with 3 people having the same experience. Have you thought about doing a history check of the home? It might give you some insight as to what's going on. Thank you for your story, Stephanie. It truly is amazing. That's all the stories for this time. Come back next week for more of your stories. Our featured story for this week is something pretty special. I'm constantly on the lookout for unique stories that I think should challenge our minds. This one checks all the boxes and is a real mind-bender. It first appeared in the pages of Amazing Stories magazine in November of 1942. It received some critical acclaim and opened with this tagline: "A scream of brakes, a splash into icy water, a long descent into alkaline depths. It was death. But Ned Vince lived again, 1 million years later." The story is called The Eternal Wall, was written by Raymond Z. Galloon, and is read for us by Greg Marguerite.
"See you in half an hour, Betty," said Ned Vince over the party telephone. "We'll be out at the Silver Basket before 10:30. Ned Vince was eager for the company of the girl he loved. That was why he was in a hurry to get to the neighboring town of Hurley, where she lived. His old car rattled and roared as he swung it recklessly around Pit Bend. There was where death tapped him on the shoulder. Another car leaped suddenly into view, its lights glaring blindingly past a high, up-jutting mass of Jurassic rock at the turn of the road. Dazzled and befuddled by his own rash speed, Ned Vince had only swift young reflexes to rely on to avoid a fearful telescoping collision. He flicked his wheel smoothly to the right, but the County Highway Commission hadn't yet tarred the traffic-loosened gravel at the bend. Ned could scarcely have chosen a worse place to start sliding and spinning. His car hit the white-painted wooden rail sideways, crashed through, tumbled down a steep slope, struck a huge boulder, bounced up a little, and arced outward, falling as gracefully as a swan diver toward the inky waters of the pit 50 feet beneath. Ned Vince was still dimly conscious when that black, quiet pool geysered around him in a mighty splash. He had only a dazzling welt on his forehead and a gag of terror in his throat. Movement was slower now, as he began to sink, trapped inside his wrecked car. Nothing that he could imagine could mean doom more certainly than this. The pit was a tremendously deep pocket in the ground, spring-fed. The edges of that almost bottomless pool were caked with a rim of white, for the water, on which dead birds so often floated, was surcharged with alkali. As that heavy nitronious liquid rushed up through the openings and cracks beneath his feet, Ned Vince knew that his friends and family would never see his body again, lost beyond recovery in this abyss. The car was deeply submerged. The light had blinked out on the dash panel, leaving Ned in absolute darkness. A flood rushed in at the shattered window. He clawed at the door, trying to open it, but it was jammed in the crash-bent frame, and he couldn't fight against the force of that incoming water. The welt left by the blow he had received on his forehead put a thickening mist over his brain so that he could not think clearly. Presently, when he could no longer hold his breath, bitter liquid was sucked into his lungs. His last thoughts were those of a drowning man. The machine shop he and his dad had had in Harwich, Betty Moore with the smiling Irish eyes, like in the song. Betty and he had planned to go to the State University this fall. They'd planned to be married sometime. Goodbye, Betty. The ripples that had ruffled the surface waters in the pit quieted again to glassy smoothness. The eternal stars shone calmly. The geologic Dakota hills, which might have seen the dinosaurs, still bulked along the highway. Time, the brother of death and the father of change, seemed to wait. "Kali! Tick, 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 Kali!" The excited cry, which no human throat could quite have duplicated accurately, arose thinly from the depths of a powder-dry gulch, water-scarred from an inconceivable antiquity. The noonday sun was red and huge. The air was tenuous, dehydrated, chill. "Kali! Tick, 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 tick." At first there was only one voice uttering those weird, triumphant sounds. Then other vocal organs took up that trilling wail and those short, sharp chuckles of eagerness. Other questioning, wondering notes mixed with the cadence. Lacking qualities identifiable as human, the disturbance was still like the babble of a group of workmen who have discovered something remarkable. The desolate expanse around the gulch was all but without motion. The icy breeze tore tiny puffs of dust from grotesque, angling drifts of soil, nearly waterless for eons. Patches of drab lichen grew here and there on the up-jutting rocks, but in the desert itself no other life was visible. Even the hills had sagged away, flattened by incalculable ages of erosion. At a mile distance, a crumbling heap of rubble arose. Once it had been a building. A gigantic, jagged mass of detritus slanted upward from its crest, red debris that had once been steel. A launching catapult for the last spaceships built by the gods in Exodus. Perhaps it was 500,000 years ago? Man was gone from the Earth. Glacial ages, war, decadence, disease, and a final scattering of those ultimate superhumans to newer worlds in other solar systems had done that. Kali! The sounds were not human. They were more like the chatter and wail of small desert animals. But there was a seeming paradox here in the depths of the gulch, too. The glint of metal, sharp and burnished, the flat, streamlined bulk of a flying machine, shiny and new, the bell-like muzzle of a strange excavator apparatus which seemed to depend on a blast of atoms to clear away rock and soil. Thus the gulch had been cleared of the accumulated rubbish of antiquity. Man, it seemed, had a successor as ruler of the earth. Lloyd Chuck had flown his geological expedition out from the far lowlands to the east, out from the city of Ra, and he was very happy now, flushed with a vast and unlooked-for success. He crouched there on his haunches at the dry bottom of the pit. The breeze rumpled his long brown fur. He wasn't very different in appearance from his ancestors, a foot tall perhaps, as he squatted there in that antique stance of his. His tail was short and furred, his undersides creamy. White whiskers spread around his inquisitive, pink-tipped snout. But his cranium bulged up and forward between shrewd, beady eyes, betraying the slow heritage of time, of survival of the fittest, of evolution. He could think and dream and invent, and the civilization of his kind was already far beyond that of the ancient 20th century. Lloyd Chuck and his fellow workers were gathered, tense and gleeful, around the things their digging had exposed to the daylight. There was a gob of junk, scarcely more than an irregular formation of flaky rust, but embedded in it was a huddled form, brown and hard as old wood. The dry mud that had encased it like an airtight coffin had by now been chipped away by the tiny investigators. But soiled clothing still hung to it, after perhaps 1,000,000 years. Metal had gone into decay, yes, but not this body. The answer to this was simple: alkali. A mineral saturation that had held time and change in stasis. A perfect preservative for organic tissue, aided probably during most of these passing eras by desert dryness. The Dakotas had turned arid very swiftly. This body was not a mere fossil. It was a mummy. Kali! Man, that meant. Not the star-conquering demigods, but the ancestral stock that had built the first machines on Earth, and in the early 21st century the first interplanetary rockets. No wonder Lloyd Chuck and his co-workers were happy in their paleontological enthusiasm. A strange accident, happening in a legendary antiquity, had aided them in their quest for knowledge. At last Lloyd Chuck gave a soft chirping signal. The chant of triumph ended, while instruments flicked in his tiny hands. The final instrument he used to test the mummy looked like a miniature stereoscope with complicated details. He held it over his eyes. On the tiny screen within, through the agency of focused X-rays, he saw magnified images of the internal organs of this ancient human corpse. What his probing gaze revealed to him made his pleasure even greater than before. In twittering, chattering sounds he communicated his further knowledge to his henchmen. Though devoid of moisture, the mummy was perfectly preserved, even to its brain cells. Medical and biological sciences were far advanced among Lloyd Chuck's kind. Perhaps by the application of principles long known to them, this long-dead body could be made to live again. It might move, speak, remember its past. What a marvelous subject for study it would make back there in the museums of Ra. But Lloyd silenced this fresh, eager chattering with a command. Work was always more substantial than cheering. With infinite care, small, sharp hand tools were used. Now the mummy of Ned Vince was disengaged from the worthless rust of his primitive automobile. With infinite care it was crated in a metal case and hauled into the flying machine. Flashing flame, the latter arose, bearing the entire 100 members of the expedition. The craft shot eastward at bullet-like speed. The spreading continental plateau of North America seemed to crawl backward beneath. A tremendous sand desert marked with low, washed-down mountains and the vague, angular geometric mounds of human cities that were gone forever. Beyond the eastern rim of the continent, the plain dipped downward steeply. The white of dried salt was on the hills, but there was a little green growth here, too. The dead sea bottom of the vanished Atlantic was not as dead as the highlands. Far out in a deep valley, Kar-Ra, the city of the rodents, came into view, a crystalline maze of low bubble-like structures glinting in the red sunshine. But this was only its surface aspect. Loy Chuck's people had built their homes mostly underground since the beginning of their foggy evolution. Besides, in this latter day, the nights were very cold. The shelter of subterranean passages and rooms was welcome. The mummy was taken to Loy Chuck's laboratory, a short distance below the surface. Here at once the scientist began his work. The body of the ancient man was put in a large vat. Fluids submerged it, slowly soaking from that hardened flesh the alkali that had preserved it for so long. The fluid was changed often until woody muscles and other tissues became pliable once more. Then the more delicate process began. Still submerged in liquid, the corpse was submitted to a flow of restorative energy passing between complicated electrodes. The cells of antique flesh and brain gradually took on a chemical composition nearer to that of the life that they had once known. At last the final liquid was drained away, and the mummy lay there, a mummy no more, but a pale, silent figure in its tatters of clothing. Loy Chuck put an odd metal fabric helmet on its head, and a second, much smaller helmet on his own. Connected with this arrangement was a black box of many uses. For hours he worked with his apparatus, studying and guiding the recording instruments. The time passed swiftly. At last, eager and ready for whatever might happen now, Loy Chuck pushed another switch. With a cold, rosy flare, energy blazed around that moveless form. For Ned Vince, timeless eternity ended like a gradual fading mist. When he could see clearly again, he experienced that inevitable shock of vast change around him. Though it had been dehydrated, his brain had been kept perfectly intact through the ages, and now it was restored. So his memories were as vivid as yesterday. Yet through that crystalline vat in which he lay, he could see a broad, low room in which he could barely have stood erect. He saw instruments and equipment whose weird shapes suggested alienness and knowledge beyond the era he had known. The walls were lavender and phosphorescent. Fossil bone fragments were mounted in shallow cases. Dinosaur bones, some of them seemed from their size, but there was a complete skeleton of a dog, too, and the skeleton of a man, and a second man skeleton that was not quite human. Its neck vertebrae were very thick and solid, its shoulders were wide, and its skull was gigantic. All this weirdness had a violent effect on Ned Vince, a sudden nostalgic panic. Something was fearfully wrong. The nervous terror of the unknown was on him. Feeble and dizzy after his weird resurrection, which he could not understand, remembering as he did that moment of sinking to certain death in the pool at Pit Bend, he caught the edge of the transparent vat and pulled himself to a sitting posture. There was a muffled murmur around him, as of some vast unearthly metropolis. "Take it easy, Ned Vince." The words themselves and the way they were assembled were old, familiar friends, but the tone was wrong. It was high, shrill, parrot-like, and mechanical. Ned's gaze searched for the source of the voice, located the black box just outside of his crystal vat. From that box the voice seemed to have originated. Before it crouched a small brownish animal with a bulging head. The animal's tiny fingered paws, hands they were, really, were touching rows of keys. To Ned Vince it was all utterly insane and incomprehensible. A rodent looking like a prairie dog, a little, but plainly possessing a high order of intelligence, and a voice whose soothingly familiar words were more repugnant somehow, simply because they could never belong in a place as eerie as this. Ned Vince did not know how Loy Chuck had probed his brain with the aid of a pair of helmets and the black box apparatus. He did not know that, in the latter, his language taken from his own revitalized mind was recorded, and that Loy Chuck had only to press certain buttons to make the instrument express his thoughts in common, long-dead English. Loy, whose vocal organs were not human, would have had great difficulty speaking English words anyway. Ned's dark hair was wildly awry. His gaunt young face held befuddled terror. He gasped in the thin atmosphere. "I've gone nuts," he pronounced with a curious calm. "Stark, starin' nuts." Loy's box, with its recorded English words and its sonic detectors, could translate for its master, too. As the man spoke, Loy read the illuminated symbols in his own language, flashed on a frosted crystal plate before him. Thus he knew what Ned Vince was saying. Loy Chuck pressed more keys, and the box reproduced his answer. No, Ned, not nuts. Not a bit of it. There are just a lot of things that you've got to get used to, that's all. You drowned about 1,000,000 years ago. I discovered your body. I brought you back to life. We have science that can do that. I'm Loy Chuck. It took only a moment for the box to tell the full story in clear, bold, friendly terms. Thus Loy sought with calm human logic to make his charge feel at home. Probably, though, he was a fool to suppose that he could succeed thus. Vince started to mutter, struggling desperately to reason it out. Prairie dog, he said, speaking to me 1,000,000 years. Evolution. The scientists say that people grew up from fishes in the sea. Prairie dogs are smart, so maybe super prairie dogs could come from them. A lot easier than men from fish. It was all sound logic. Even Ned Vince knew that. Still, his mind tuned to ordinary simple things, couldn't quite realize all the vast things that had happened to himself and to the world. The scope of it all was too staggeringly big. 1,000,000 years? God! Ned Vince made a last effort to control himself. His knuckles tightened on the edge of the vat. I don't know what you've been talking about, he grated wildly, but I want to get out of here. I want to go back where I came from. Do you understand, whoever or whatever you are? Loy Chuck pressed more keys. But you can't go back to the 20th century, said the box. Nor is there any better place for you to be now than Kara. You are the only man left on Earth. Those men that exist in other star systems are not really your kind anymore. Though their forefathers originated on this planet, they have gone far beyond you in evolution. To them you would be only a senseless curiosity. You are much better off with my people. Our minds are much more like yours. We will take care of you and make you comfortable. But Ned Vince wasn't listening now. You are the only man left on Earth. That had been enough for him to hear. He didn't more than half believe it. His mind was too confused for conviction about anything. Everything he saw and felt and heard might be some kind of nightmare. But then it might all be real instead, and that was abysmal horror. Ned was no coward. Death and danger of any ordinary earthly kind he could have faced bravely, but the loneliness here and the utter strangeness were hideous, like being stranded alone on another world. His heart was pounding heavily and his eyes were wide. He looked across this eerie room. There was a ramp there at the other side, leading upward instead of a stairway. Fierce impulse to escape this nameless lair, to try to learn the facts for himself, possessed him. He bounded out of the vat, and with head down, dashed for the ramp. He had to go most of the way on his hands and knees, for the upslanting passage was low. Excited animal chucklings around him, and the occasional touch of a furry body, hurried his feverish scrambling. But he emerged at last at the surface. He stood there panting in that frigid, rarefied air. It was night. The moon was a gigantic, pock-marked bulk. The constellations were unrecognizable. The rodent city was a glowing expanse of shallow crystalline domes set among odd scrub trees and bushes. The crags loomed on all sides, all their jaggedness lost after 1,000,000 years of erosion under an ocean that was gone. In that ghastly moonlight, the ground glistened with dry salt. Well, I guess it's all true. Huh. Ned Vince muttered in a flat tone. Behind him he heard an excited, squeaky chattering. Rodents in pursuit. Looking back, he saw the pinpoint gleams of countless little eyes. Yes, he might as well be in exile on another planet, so changed had the Earth become. A wave of intolerable homesickness came over him as he sensed the distances of time that had passed. Those inconceivable eons separating himself from his friends, from Betty, from almost everything that was familiar. He started to run away from those glittering rodent eyes. He sensed death in that cold sea bottom. But what of it? What reason did he have left to live? He'd be only a museum piece here, a thing to be caged and studied. Prison or a madhouse would be far better. He tried to get a hold of his courage, but what was there to inspire it? Nothing. He laughed harshly as he ran, welcoming that bitter, killing cold. Nostalgia had him in its clutch, and there was no answer in this hell world, lost beyond the barrier of the years. Lloyd Chuck and his followers presently came upon Ned Vince's unconscious form a mile from the city of Kara. In a flying machine, they took him back and applied stimulants. He came to in the same laboratory room as before, but he was firmly strapped to a low platform this time, so that he could not escape again. There he lay, helpless, until presently an idea occurred to him. It gave him a few crumbs of hope. "Hey, somebody!" he called. "You'd better get some rest, Ned Vince," came the answer from the black box. It was Lloyd Chuck speaking again. "But listen," Ned protested. "You know, a lot more than we did in the 20th century, and, well, there's that thing called time travel that I used to read about. Maybe you know how to make it work. Maybe you could send me back to my own time after all." Little Lloyd Chuck was in a black, discouraged mood himself. He could understand the utter sick dejection of this giant from the past, lost from his own kind, probably insanity looming. In far less extreme circumstances than this, death from homesickness had come. Lloyd Chuck was a scientist, in common with all real scientists, regardless of the species from which they spring. He loved the subjects of his researches. He wanted this ancient man to live and to be happy, or this creature would be of scant value for study. So Lloyd considered carefully what Ned Vince had suggested. Time travel, almost a legend, an assault upon an intangible wall that had baffled far keener wits than Lloyd's. But he was bent now on the well-being of this anachronism. He had so miraculously resurrected this human, this Kali. Lloyd jabbed buttons on the black box. "Yes, Ned Vince," said the sonic apparatus. "Time travel. Perhaps that is the only thing to do, to send you back to your own period of history. For I see that you will never be yourself here. It will be hard to accomplish, but we'll try. Now I shall put you under an anesthetic." Ned felt better immediately, for there was real hope now, where there had been none before. Maybe he'd be back in his hometown of Harwich again. Maybe he'd see the old machine shop there, and the trees greening out in spring. Maybe he'd be seeing Betty Moore in Hurley soon. Ned relaxed as a tiny hypo needle bit into his arm. As soon as Ned Vince passed into unconsciousness, Lloyd Chuck went to work once more, using that pair of brain helmets again, exploring carefully the man's mind. After hours of research, he proceeded to prepare his plans. The government of Kara was a scientific oligarchy of which Lloyd was a prime member. It would be easy to get the help he needed. A horde of small, gray-furred beings and their machines toiled for many days. Ned Vince's mind swam gradually out of the blur that had enveloped it. He was wandering aimlessly in a familiar room. The girders of the roof above were of red-painted steel. His tool benches were there, greasy and littered with metal filings, just as they had always been. He had a tractor to repair, and a seed drill. Outside of the machine shop, the old familiar yellow sun was shining. Across the street was the small brown house where he lived. With a sudden startlement, he saw Betty Moore in the doorway. She wore a blue dress, and a mischievous smile curved her lips, as though she had succeeded in creeping up on him for a surprise. "Why, Ned," she chuckled, "you look as though you've been dreaming and just woke up." He grimaced ruefully as she approached. With a kind of fierce gratitude, he took her in his arms. Yes, she was just like always. "I guess I was dreaming, Betty," he whispered, feeling that mighty sense of relief. "I must have fallen asleep at the bench here and had a nightmare. I thought I had an accident at Pit Ben and that a lot of worse things happened. But it wasn't true." Ned Vince's mind, over which there was still an elusive fog that he did not try to shake off, accepted apparent facts simply. He did not know anything about the invisible radiations beating down upon him, soothing and dimming his brain, so that it would never question or doubt or observe too closely the incongruous circumstances that must often appear. The lack of traffic in the street without, for instance, and the lack of people besides himself and Betty. He didn't know that this machine shop was built from his own memories of the original. He didn't know that this Betty was of the same origin, a miraculous fabrication of metal and energy units and soft plastic. The trees outside were only lantern slide illusions. It was all built inside a great opaque dome. But there were hidden television systems, too. Thus, Loy Chuck's kind could study this ancient man, this Kali. Thus, their motives were mostly selfish. Loy, though, was not observing now. He had wandered far out into the cold, sad sea bottom to ponder. He squeaked and chattered to himself, contemplating the magnificent, inexorable march of the ages. He remembered the ancient ruins left by the final supermen. The Kali believes himself home, Loy was thinking. He will survive and be happy. But there was no other way. Time is an eternal wall. Our archaeological researches among the cities of the supermen show the truth. Even they who once ruled the earth never escaped from the present by so much as an instant. End of The Eternal Wall by Raymond Z. Galoon.
What did you think of that one? Keep in mind that it was written in 1942 and has to be one of the first stories ever to even breach the concept of virtual reality. That alone is amazing. The author of the story was Raymond Z. Galoon. He was an American science fiction writer. Galoon was born in Beaver Dam, Wisconsin. He left college after 1 year and traveled in Europe, living a drifter's existence in the years leading up to World War II. He was among the stalwart group of early sci-fi pulp writers who made the genre what it is today. He sold many popular stories in the 1930s. These include Old Faithful, The Gentle Brain, and of course our story, The Eternal Wall. His first book, People Minus X, was published in 1957, followed by The Planet Strappers in 1961. Galoon was honored with the Icon Lifetime Achievement Award in 1985 at Icon 4. Strangely enough, that award was later renamed the Raymond Z. Galoon Award. How about that?
Not so important times in history.
In this segment, we take a look at historical events that may otherwise go unnoticed. We look at history with a fish-eyed lens, giving a perspective that should provide no insight to anyone or any time. But it is historical, or hysterical, as the case may be. Join us now for this event in history. Do you remember the date, Thursday, March 31st, 1803? It may not ring any bells unless you were alive during the Napoleonic Wars. Residents of a small North England town called Hartlepool witnessed a French ship capsize off the coast. They found that everyone on board died except for a little monkey which they saw hanging on to a piece of rubbish. As subjects of severe wartime propaganda, the Englishmen believed that the monkey was an actual Frenchman. Also, they saw that the monkey was dressed in full military regalia, which confused them even more. They decided to interrogate the little furry creature. They brought the monkey ashore and administered a trial. When the monkey wouldn't talk, they assumed it was just being uncooperative. They got fed up and eventually built a makeshift hanging gallows and executed the poor little primate. Now, you might think this was the end of the little guy's story. It wasn't. The earliest mention of the hanging is from a popular song called The Monkey Song. It was written and performed by a 19th century comic performer, Ned Vince. Here is a bit of that song that was sung by a fan of the local football club, Hartlepool United, whose nickname just happens to be the Monkey Hangers.
It was up in dear old Hartlepool about the time of France. The Emperor Napoleon was leading us a dance, when up along the coast came a British man of war. The captain's old pet monkey got washed up on the shore, singing, "Oh, folksy, young folks, everyone and each, come and see the Frenchie that's landed on the beach. He's got long arms, a great long tail, and he's covered all in hair. We think that he's a spy, so we'll hang him in the square." Well, a Lord Mayor of Hartlepool was walking along the shore, when he seen this little hairy man he'd never seen before. Sitting in the sand was this hairy little man, clutching a banana in his little hairy hand, singing, "Old folks, young folks, everyone and each, come and see the Frenchie who's landed on the beach. He's got long arms, a great long tail, and he's covered all in hair. We think that he's a spy, so we'll hang him in the square." So they hung that little Frenchie from the gallows in the town, with a rope wrapped round his necky neck and his long tail hanging down. 'Twas a warning to Napoleon to make himself a rule, not to send his little hairy spies to dear old Hartlepool, singing, "Oh, folksy, young folks, everyone and each, come and see the Frenchie who's landed on the beach. He's got long arms, a great long tail, and he's covered all in hair. We think that he's a spy, so we'll hang him in the square." There you go, George. All the best, funny lad.
I hope you enjoyed this edition of Not So Important Times in History. It was brought to you by Gladys Goodies. Great treats for your dog to eat. Gladys Goodies has just introduced their newest treat. Little Bits liver sticks are a great source of vitamins for your pet. These treats are for cats and dogs alike and are made from 100% beef liver. Did you know that liver is a nutrient-rich organ that most pets love? You can get these treats and some really cool swag for your dog and cat at GladysGoodies.com. And don't forget to use our promo code RONS, that's RONS, to get a 20% discount on all of your purchases. That website again is GladysGoodies.com. No monkeys were injured during the recording of this segment. We did it. Episode 430 is in the books. I have to thank Scott Rickoff, Ora Parker, Grady Carr, Archive 645, Stephanie Ferguson, and Greg Marguerite. You all did great. If you want to follow the podcast or the blog, just head to ronsamazingstories.com. There you will find a plethora of links that should fit every need. Do you want to help the show? The best thing you can do is to tell your friends about it, and please leave reviews or feedback wherever you listen. This helps us to grow. Thank you for listening, and I hope you come again to find out what are Ron's Amazing Stories.